to what extent, when you work with government services and with charities, do you only work with architects, or do you work with different types of professionals with different disciplinary background?
Okay. So Architects Aware, the think tank, has people from architectural, governmental and policy making, development and charity and other backgrounds, for that exact reason that the issue needs to be looked at in a multi-pronged way. So when we work with the government, we work with people from housing backgrounds, funding backgrounds, townscape backgrounds, kind of architectural, construction, development, viability within the government. But we bring with us a team of people, again, which is not just architects, so that we can have big conversations. And even on that basis, it's tricky because, so coming back to the guidelines, we've been trying to get a line changed in planning policy for 2 years, just one line to acknowledge emergency homeless accommodation as a specialist supported type. We have kind of verbal confirmation that our guidelines will become policy. We have verbal confirmation that that line will be changed, but it's been 2 years. And I think it will, but it just shows that despite that kind of roundtable approach, and they will sit in meetings and say, we want to change it, it's just very difficult to make this level of change. So it's not like us and them. Everybody wants the same thing. It's just how we can be a bit brave and a bit innovative in challenging systems when they're not working for us.
Well, this is extremely interesting, and I think all these innovations that you've been doing, I think interest us quite a lot. If we put that in perspective, in your view, how you've mentioned very often that you have been in contact with government officials in various groups and various conversation, and your production have got some influence probably. But how do you think, and what do you think political leaders are really, what do they do, and to what extent do you think they have reacted to your efforts so far? What we understand from what you've said so far is that the pandemics was central to reveal the scale of the issue and to justify new interventions. But to what extent, after the pandemics, if that makes sense, one day, to what extent do you think that political leaders are aware of the issue and want to deal with this question, both at the national level and in cities, and in London in particular?
I think they're very aware of the issue. And I think, it's really tricky because the strategy is housing first. And all problems do stem from a lack of, affordable or any housing to meet the needs of the population. So quite often you look at homelessness and it's seen as reactive rather than proactive. And no, we should tackle the issue at the top rather than the bottom. But the point stands that homelessness exists, it's unacceptable, and there's very little mechanism to address that. So they're very aware. And I think the pandemic has definitely changed, as you said, the kind of recognition and the capacity for funding. But the problem is, it's, as I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all approach. So it's kind of getting that diversity of offer and getting them to change systems much more quickly to adapt to meet those needs that is the challenge. So everybody wants to help. Everybody knows it's a problem. Everybody wants to move to it, but they're just not doing that quickly enough. And I think if we can be more innovative and a little bit braver, and actually, not everything has to be lined up in the way that takes 5 years to implement that change. So I think that's the bit that is the tricky bit, because it's not manipulative. It's everyone wants to help. It's just people being stuck in certain systems. That's my view anyway.
I think you're quite right to emphasize the time dimension, but coming back to the public policies and the lack of investment. I mean, when I look at the figures, it's quite clear that despite growth of population, London has built less new homes than the other big cities from like New York or Paris. And what is missing for having more investment in housing and in different types of housing, as you mentioned, because you emphasize that everybody wants to do it. but that's not really what has happened for quite a while. And can I push you a little bit on one thing? You have mentioned a lot affordable housing, but some of the people in the UK says it's a way to really hide the questions of real social housing for those with most needs. What do you think about that?
Another difficult question. I think pressure on building is extremely high right now, particularly as we're all experiencing with costs of building. So it's I can see all sides, obviously. The actual need to build and the need to incentivize people to build more and more quickly is key. But again, I always talk about diversity of offer. I've talked about diversity of offer in kind of homelessness, but also within housing typologies, which I think is getting better. There's recognition of kind of key worker housing and later living and lots of alternative typologies. It's just how they're placed in that kind of funding and planning system, and how they're sort of recognized and funded for, like, not just in sort of central government, but how that sort of disperses down to local governments, and whether that really, how that's kind of meeting the need of the borough is something that I guess probably maybe needs a bit more debate. But I don't think it's fair to say that that it's totally a broad brush approach. I guess it's just understanding how the way it's applied meets the actual needs of kind of the demographics in the areas.